The sound was not what I expected. It was not the dramatic crash of a Hollywood film, but a dry, crystalline explosion, a sharp pop that seemed to suck the air from the room before releasing it in a shower of glittering fragments. One moment, I was standing in my son's kitchen, the scent of pine from the winter wreath on the door filling my senses. The next, I was on my back in the snow, the cold seeping through my coat, a strange warmth spreading across my arm. I looked down and saw crimson blooming against the white linen of my sleeve. My son Bradley and his wife Juliana stood framed in the jagged maw of the doorway, their faces a mixture of shock and something colder, something I did not want to name. They called it an accident, a terrible, unfortunate accident. They said I had lost my balance, that they were only trying to help me step outside for some fresh air. But their words were hollow, brittle things that shattered in the frigid air just as the glass had. I sat there in the cold, a 71-year-old woman with blood on her hands, and a profound silence settled over me. It was in that silence that I thought, perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was worthless now, an old woman with no paycheck, no purpose, just a name on a deed they so desperately wanted. But as the silence deepened, another thought rose to the surface, a secret I had guarded for years, a truth so vast it could swallow their entire world whole. What they saw was a frail old woman, a burden to be managed. What they never saw, what they could never imagine, was the $21 million held in trusts and investments, a fortune I had quietly built, a legacy left to me that they knew nothing about. They thought I had nothing left. A wave of icy calm washed over me, extinguishing the sting of the cold and the throb of my arm. I wondered, with a clarity that was almost terrifying, what they would do when they finally realized the truth. What would happen when they understood that the woman they had just thrown through a glass door could buy and sell everything they owned, everything they had ever aspired to, with the stroke of a pen? It had happened on a Tuesday. The snow had just begun to fall, soft, fat flakes drifting down from a sky the color of slate. It was the kind of quiet snow that muffles the world, creating a hush, a stillness that often precedes something breaking. The tension in the house had been building all morning, a low hum of resentment that vibrated just beneath the surface of their polite conversation. I had tried to make myself small, a skill that older women often learn when they sense their presence is an inconvenience rather than a comfort. I stayed in my corner of the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea, listening to the clock on the wall tick away the seconds of a peace I knew was fragile. Juliana stood at the counter, her arms crossed, her posture as rigid as her voice when she finally spoke. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you?" She didn't raise her voice. She never did. Her power lay in her tone, a sharp, precise instrument that could slice through you without leaving a visible wound. I looked at her, then at my son. Bradley would not meet my eyes. He was staring at his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen in a frantic, meaningless motion, as if the device in his hands was a shield that could protect him from the conversation, from his own complicity. But this involved him. It involved all of us. The house, the one I had paid off 27 years ago, the one where I had raised him, still had my name, and only my name, on it. This fact was a stone in their shoe, a constant irritant they were determined to remove. I knew they had been planning something. The whispers that stopped when I entered a room, the way my mail was sometimes missing, the sudden locking of drawers that had always been open. I had seen the signs, but I had kept my silence, hoping it was just my imagination, the paranoia of an old woman who feared being left behind. I told her calmly that I wasn't ready to sign anything. I suggested we could sit down later, after dinner perhaps, and talk it through like a family, maybe after dinner. The words hung in the air, a flimsy offering of peace. Juliana did not wait. She took 2 purposeful steps toward me, her face a mask of false concern. She pointed toward the back door, the one now shattered. She said I needed some fresh air, that I was getting emotional, that it was better if I stepped out for a moment. Her hand gripped my arm. It was not a violent grip, not at first, but it was firm, insistent. Then, something shifted in the air, a subtle change in pressure. Bradley, still silent, moved to her side. I remember his hand brushing mine, a fleeting, almost gentle touch, as if he meant to help me. I remember the tightness in his jaw, a muscle twitching just below his ear. The next second, the world tilted. It was not a shove, not in the way one would imagine. It was a push, a coordinated, deliberate transfer of momentum. My back hit the glass, the dry crack echoed in the sudden silence. And then, everything gave way. I landed outside, half in the snow, half in a bed of glittering shards. The cold bit into my skin, 1,000 tiny needles. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the sharp, clean fragrance of pine and winter. For a long, silent moment, I thought I might never get up again. I thought I might simply lie there and let the snow cover me, a final, quiet surrender. But then, a lifetime of resilience, of getting up after being knocked down, took over. I have always gotten up. From inside, Juliana's voice, now laced with a frantic, theatrical panic, shouted that it was an accident, that I had lost my balance, that they were only trying to help. But they didn't open the door. They didn't come to check on me. Not even Bradley. I pushed myself to my feet, my body aching, my hand bleeding freely now. My coat was torn. The snow was soaking through my shoes, numbing my toes, and yet all I could feel was a profound and unnerving stillness. It was not shock. It was not pain. It was the quiet, final snap of something inside me breaking and then resetting itself, harder and stronger than before. I turned away from the house, from the broken door, and the two figures silhouetted within it. I walked down the driveway without a single word, without a single look back. Each step was deliberate, measured. It was not the first time they had made me feel like an obstacle, an unwelcome guest in my own life. But it was the first time I saw it with perfect, brutal clarity. They wanted me gone. They had plans for this house, for my money, for a future that did not include me. In their eyes, I was no longer the mother who had raised him, the woman who had sacrificed for him. I was an obstacle. A signature on a piece of paper. A delay in their plans. I did not go to the hospital. My training as a nurse told me the cut was not deep enough to be dangerous, only messy. Instead, I went to the diner on 4th and Maple, a place that smelled of coffee and old vinyl. I slid into the back booth, the cracked leather cool against my skin. I ordered a coffee, with extra cream. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, did not flinch when she saw the blood still seeping through the napkin I had wrapped around my hand. She simply placed my coffee on the table, handed me a fresh stack of napkins, and said, "Take your time, honey." And I did. That night, as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine, deceptive white, I used a burner phone I had bought months ago to book a rental car and check into a motel on the edge of town. My hands still ached, but my mind was sharper, clearer than it had been in years. The fog of love and maternal obligation had been shattered along with the glass. I knew I had to act carefully, quietly. I was not going to scream or beg or play the victim. I was going to do what I had always done best throughout my long career as a hospital administrator. I was going to observe, to think, and to move with precision. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished. But they had forgotten who had built this life in the first place. They had forgotten who made sure they never went hungry, who had paid off their college loans without a second thought, who had co-signed the mortgage for their first overpriced home. They had forgotten. But I hadn't. Some stories do not begin with a smile or a celebration. Some stories begin with the sound of broken glass and the profound silence that follows. But silence, when it is chosen, can be the most powerful weapon of all. And my silence was just beginning. I stayed at that motel for 3 nights. It was the kind of place that exists in a state of perpetual twilight, where the sheets always felt cold and the ceiling fan made a soft, ticking sound, like an old clock running out of time. But it was anonymous, and it was quiet. And at that moment, I needed quiet more than I needed comfort. The morning after the incident, I rose before the Sunday. My hand had swollen, a dull purple ache, but I cleaned the wound with antiseptic from the first aid kit in my car and wrapped it tightly in fresh gauze. With my good hand, I took a pen and a small notebook from my purse and made a list. It was a short list, with just 4 items, each one simple, measurable, a small island of control in an ocean of betrayal. At the top of the list, I wrote a single word: proof. For decades, I had trusted my instincts. I had spent my career reading people in boardrooms and mediation sessions, diffusing conflict with nothing more than a calm voice and the right choice of words. I could sense a lie before it was fully formed on someone's lips. But this was not a professional negotiation. This was my life. This was my son. This was my home. The lines had blurred so slowly over the years, a gradual erosion of boundaries, until I could no longer tell if I was living with family or with people who were simply waiting for me to die. Then, I remembered, something from a few months earlier, on a quiet afternoon when Juliana had taken the children to her mother's and I had the house to myself. A flicker of unease, a premonition I could not explain, had prompted me to do something I never thought I would. I had installed a small security camera. It was nothing fancy, just a simple device tucked into the corner of the bookshelf in the living room, disguised as a small ceramic owl. I had told no one. I had hoped I would never need it. But after that moment at the door, after the feel of their hands on my back, I knew. I called the one person I trusted to help me, a woman named Maya. She was an old colleague from the hospital network where I had been an executive. Maya worked in compliance and tech security. She was as sharp as a scalpel and had a gift for never asking unnecessary questions. Within 2 hours, she had recovered the footage from the cloud server and sent a secure link to my private drive. I sat on the edge of the lumpy motel bed, my laptop open, and I watched it. I watched it once, and only once. That was enough. The video was clear, the audio crisp, Juliana's sharp, insistent voice, Bradley's silent, looming presence. The angle of their hands, the sound of my body hitting the glass, a sickening thud followed by the sharp, splintering crack, and then the silence. The long, damning silence as they stood there, not moving, not helping. There was no denying it now. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a family argument that had gotten out of hand. This was assault, and they had tried to cover it with a thin veil of false concern, all while their eyes were fixed on the house I had paid for with a lifetime of work, the house that was my last sanctuary. The next day, I called a lawyer. Her name was Nadine, a woman in her 50s with a voice that sounded like gravel and steel. I had found her through a discreet referral service for high-net-worth individuals. Her reputation was impeccable. She did not ask for the drama, for the tears, for the emotional backstory. She asked for one thing: documentation. I gave her everything. The secure link to the video, the deed to the house, copies of my financial statements. While she began the meticulous process of drafting a case for elder abuse and property coercion, I set the rest of my plan into motion. I visited a branch of my bank in a neighboring town, a place where no one knew my face. I withdrew enough cash to ensure my movements would be swift and unhindered, but not so much that it would raise any red flags. The vast majority of my funds remained untouched, a silent, sleeping giant. $21 million, spread across municipal bonds, a private real estate trust, and a separate account linked to a trust fund left to me by a grateful client years ago. It was a fortune accumulated over a lifetime of prudent decisions and quiet work. I had never spoken of it to Bradley. He and Juliana assumed my retirement was funded by a modest pension, that I lived on Social Security and the leftovers from his father's life insurance. That assumption had made them comfortable. It had fueled their entitlement. It had made them careless. And Juliana, with her sharp suits and sharper ambition, she never imagined that the quiet old woman in the soft sweaters was more than she appeared. She saw gray hair and slow movements, and she dismissed me. But I had been building something they had never bothered to see. I rented a short-term apartment in a new, anonymous building downtown under a different name. A simple month-to-month lease. No frills, no noise. I didn't need a view. I needed a command center. The first thing I placed on the clean, empty kitchen counter was a plain black folder. Inside it, I put a printed still frame from the security footage, a copy of the house deed, my living will, and the first draft of the legal complaint from Nadine. Then I sat down in a hard-backed chair, breathed in the sterile air of my new temporary life, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel everything. The sharp, piercing sting of betrayal, the deep, burning humiliation, the profound ache of being seen as disposable by the very person I had given everything to. But beneath the ache, something else was beginning to bloom. It was not a desire for revenge, not a thirst to punish or destroy. It was a quiet, unshakable resolve, a resolve to reclaim. Not just my name on a piece of paper, not just the bricks and mortar of my house, but my space, my dignity, and my rightful place in the world. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was only the beginning of their reckoning. I woke before the sun rose, not from restlessness, but from a newfound sense of clarity. There was a strange comfort in the quiet anonymity of my new apartment. The gentle hum of the heater, the distant murmur of early morning traffic, the soft, hollow sound of my slippers on the linoleum floor. It was the sound of a life stripped down to its essentials. I boiled water for tea and stood before the black folder on the counter. It was a plain, unassuming object, but it held the weight of my past and the blueprint for my future. Inside, there were 3 key documents. The first was the pristine, printed copy of the house deed. My name, Eleanor Vance, was there in clear, unambiguous type. No joint ownership, no transfer signatures, nothing. For years they had pushed, gently at first, then with increasing impatience, for me to add Bradley's name. I had always held off, citing a small, persistent pull in my gut that whispered, "Wait." That instinct, that quiet internal warning had saved me. The second document was a ledger of my financial holdings. I had printed it not out of pride, but for the sake of facts. The $21 million had accumulated over decades, a result of quiet, strategic investments in long-term care facilities, hospital systems, and wellness centers across 3 states. Some of it had come from grateful former clients who had left pieces of their estates to me in their wills, small tokens of gratitude that had grown into significant sums over time. I had never lived lavishly. I never needed to. I had always had enough. The third item was the still frame from the security footage, printed on a single sheet of paper, my face caught in a moment of surprise. My hands slightly raised, the blur of motion as my son and his wife propelled me backward. I closed the folder gently. Today, I would begin filing the formal paperwork with Nadine. But before that, I needed to look backward one last time, to understand how I had arrived at this precipice. I pulled an old notebook from my purse. It had a green cloth cover, its edges worn soft from years of use. I had used it to jot down notes, conversations, and dates, small observations from the past few years when I started to feel that something was fundamentally wrong. It was not the big moments that painted the full picture. It was the accumulation of countless small, almost insignificant ones. Like the time I noticed my mail being sorted before it reached the kitchen table, with the financial statements mysteriously disappearing. Or how Bradley had insisted on managing the utility bills himself, claiming he was making things easier for me, even though I had always paid them on time without issue. Then there were the questions from Juliana, always casual, always calculated, questions about who would inherit the house, or if I had updated my will recently. And the papers that I never saw again. My Social Security statements, the annual report from my small pension fund, the envelope from the bank. I remembered one day asking if my new Medicare card had arrived. Juliana had waved a dismissive hand and said she had put it somewhere safe for me. I never found it. Alone in that quiet apartment kitchen, I realized with a chilling certainty what I had been feeling was not paranoia. It was preparation. Their preparation. They were not waiting for me to die peacefully in my sleep. They were preparing for me to disappear quietly, without fuss, without questions, a neat and tidy erasure of my existence from their lives. I took a long, slow sip of my tea and stared out the window. The snow had returned, a fine, steady dusting that covered the city rooftops like a shroud over forgotten furniture. After a simple breakfast, I dressed with purpose. Gray trousers, a black turtleneck sweater, and my best wool coat, the same coat I had worn when I signed my first leadership contract at the hospital in 1984. That coat had seen the inside of more boardrooms than most junior partners ever would. It was a silent reminder of who I was, of the strength I had momentarily forgotten I possessed. I carried the folder into Nadine's office at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. Her assistant, a brisk young woman with short hair and clipped sentences, led me into a room lined with bookshelves groaning under the weight of legal binders. Nadine sat behind a large, clean desk. There was no clutter, no family photos, only a pen and a yellow legal pad. She did not waste time on small talk. She did not need to. She opened the folder, flipped through each page with practiced efficiency, and nodded. It took less than 30 minutes for her to confirm what I already knew in my heart. I had a case. A strong one. Not just for assault, but for a calculated pattern of financial manipulation, coercion, and the willful neglect of a dependent elder. The state of Colorado had clear, stringent laws on elder abuse, and Nadine had a long history of working with judges on cases just like this. Quietly, without media attention, but always firmly. I asked her to keep everything sealed for now. No public filings yet. I was not looking for headlines or sympathy. I wanted a resolution. She agreed. We would move slowly but deliberately, like a glacier, unstoppable and absolute. By noon, I had signed the preliminary affidavit. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, certified copies of the footage had been secured in 2 separate, secure locations. By sundown, I was back in my apartment, sitting in the same chair by the window. The folder was now thinner, its contents now in the hands of the law, but its impact felt heavier than ever. It would still be weeks before any official charges were filed, perhaps longer before a court date was set, but the motion had begun, and once a thing like this starts rolling, it cannot be undone. That night, I did not sleep much. My body ached in places it had not ached before. My hand still had a slight persistent tremor from the injury, but I no longer felt small or forgotten or invisible. I knew that the people I had raised, the family I had built, no longer saw me clearly. They saw only what they thought I represented: an obstacle, a liability, a delay. But they did not know everything. They did not know that the bulk of my funds had already been moved into a separate holding company, shielded from any potential claims. They did not know that my trust had been updated, removing all heirs until further notice. They did not know that the title of the house was not only still in my name, but was now legally protected by a revocable living trust that was nearly impossible to penetrate. And most of all, they did not know that the woman they had tried to erase had already written the next chapter of her life, a chapter that had no pages left for them. It would be weeks before they noticed anything was truly wrong. But the silence I had left behind, the silence they had mistaken for surrender, would soon grow louder than any scream. 3 days after I left Nadine's office, I received a quiet call just after 8 o'clock in the morning. It was her. Her voice was even calm, the voice of a surgeon before the first incision. The paperwork had been filed. The complaint was officially entered into the court system. She told me not to expect anything dramatic at first. These things, she said, take time. But it had begun. I did not say much on the phone, just a soft thank you. After I hung up, I stood in the middle of my small kitchen, the receiver still cool in my hand, and let the silence of the room speak louder than words. That same afternoon, I drove to a private postal center near the edge of town. I handed over a pre-sealed certified envelope. Inside were 3 printed items. The first was a copy of the official complaint filed with the court. The second was a formal letter from Nadine's law firm, requesting the immediate return of any and all documents related to the house, including mail, bills, and personal records. The third was a notice of restricted contact, a legal document stating that all future communication must go through my attorney, effective immediately. The address on the envelope was for Bradley and Juliana. I did not linger. I did not look back. By the time I returned to my apartment, the snow had started falling again, this time heavier, the kind of wet, heavy snow that presses everything down, that makes the world quieter, like a lid being placed on a pot that is slowly building pressure. I sat by the window and opened my old green notebook. Flipping back through the older entries, I saw things I had not seen before. I saw how I used to write down events that felt too small to matter at the time, but now, read together, they formed a clear and disturbing pattern, a strategy. Juliana had once accidentally signed for my medical statements and opened them. That was 4 months ago. Bradley had offered to help me by updating my property tax information online. That was last winter. They had tried to place me on their family phone plan, telling me it would save me money. Instead, I had lost access to my online banking app for 2 weeks during the transition, a period during which several unusual inquiries were made about my account. All of it had been subtle. All of it had been calculated. I made a new list that day, not a list of what I had lost, but of what I still had in my full and complete control: the deed, the trust, the footage, the law, and most importantly, myself. The following morning, Nadine emailed me a case update. The court had issued a preliminary review date. It was nothing public, no arrests, no drama. But if things continued as expected, the footage would be used as direct evidence, and a temporary restraining order could be placed upon them. I did not celebrate. I did not breathe a sigh of relief. But I felt something settle deep inside me. It was not satisfaction. It was alignment. That week, I also had a meeting with Marcus, an estate planner I had worked with years ago during the restructuring of one of my older clients' retirement portfolios. He was reliable, discreet, and always treated me as if I still held my executive title from the hospital, even though I had not worked there in over a decade. I told him my plan. I wanted to prepare the documents to move the bulk of my holdings into a new foundation, a nonprofit trust dedicated to a specific purpose, to support career retraining and wellness resources for women over 60, especially widows, especially those who had given everything to their families, only to find themselves discarded once they were no longer deemed useful. Marcus did not blink. He asked intelligent, practical questions. He gave me timelines. He told me what was possible now, and what would be wise to delay. I left his office with a binder full of draft documents and a calendar filled with quiet, purposeful steps. Outside, the city streets were slick with melting snow. Pedestrians moved carefully, cautiously. I found myself walking slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because I could finally afford to. For the first time in years, I was not rushing to prove anything to anyone. I spent that evening going through old photo albums, not out of sentimentality, but in a search for truth. I wanted to see the moments I had forgotten, the smiles that were real, the holidays where the warmth did not feel rehearsed or performed. One photograph stood out. It was Bradley, at age 12, sitting beside me on the hospital lawn during my lunch break. He was eating a sandwich I had packed for him in a lunchbox. His hair was messy, and his arm was looped casually around my shoulder. He was not cruel then. He was just a boy with too much emotion, and not enough space to process it. I held that photograph for a long time, not to find an excuse for the man he had become, but to remember where we had come from, so that I could fully understand where we had now arrived. A few days later, just as Nadine had predicted, the first response came. I received a voicemail from Juliana. Her voice was tight, professional, stripped of all warmth. She said they had received my lawyer's letter and were, in her words, surprised at the accusations. She hoped we could resolve this privately. There was no apology, no hint of regret. Just a cold, calculated attempt to regain control. She sounded more worried about the paper trail than about the shards of glass that I had later found still buried in the fabric of my coat pocket. I did not respond. I deleted the message. Nadine would handle all contact from this point forward. I was not going to argue. I was not going to explain. Instead, I prepared. I made certified copies of all my documents and stored them in 3 separate, secure locations. I scheduled a second appointment with Marcus to finalize the transfer of the first portion of the funds into the new foundation. I purchased a new winter coat, a heavy, gray wool, built for cold days and long walks. The old one, the one with the faint, faded bloodstain on the sleeve, I folded carefully and placed in a sealed bag, not to forget but to preserve the clear, sharp line between before and after. Then I went for a walk. The wind was sharp against my face, but I did not flinch. My body had adjusted to the discomfort, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. They thought that pushing me through a pane of glass would break me. What they failed to realize was that some things, when they break, do not shatter into a million useless pieces. Some things break clean, and the woman standing on the other side can come out sharper. Not bitter, just precise. And now, I had precision and paperwork and patience, and I had the law on my side. The apartment grew quieter as the week went on. The snow piled high against the window ledge, swallowing the sounds of the city outside. Each morning, I woke with the same rhythm. Tea first, then a review of my documents, then a long, brisk walk. It became a kind of silent ritual, one that helped me stay sharp without letting the sadness creep in. On the 5th morning, I did something unexpected. I drove west, into the mountains. I did not tell anyone, not even Nadine. I left just after sunrise, with a small overnight bag and my new coat. I had made a reservation under a different name, a habit I had picked up during my years managing high-profile hospital staff who required absolute discretion. Some skills, I realized, never leave you. The road twisted and climbed through forests of tall pines and past frozen lakes. The sky hung low, a uniform gray. When I arrived in Aspen, it was nearly noon. The snow was thicker there, fresh and untouched. The air felt cleaner, purer than anything I had breathed in weeks. I checked into a small, private cabin near the hot springs. It was not extravagant, but it was clean and secluded, with a fireplace, a view of the slopes, and a full kitchen that I had no intention of using. I was not there for leisure. I was there to breathe in the silence, to remember who I was before the noise of their expectations and disappointments had begun. That evening, I soaked in the outdoor mineral pool. The water was hot, almost too hot against the frigid air. Steam rose in thick clouds around me, obscuring the world. I stayed under the surface longer than usual, holding my breath, not to forget, but to empty myself, to make room for what was to come. The next morning, I woke early and sat on the wooden deck, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping coffee. I thought about the version of myself who used to make excuses for how Bradley treated me. The woman who used to say, "Maybe he is just stressed from work. Maybe he is just trying to protect Juliana. Maybe I misunderstood what he meant." I had stopped making those excuses the day my back hit the glass. Now, looking back with sharper eyes, I began to make new outlines in my mind, not for court dates or legal documents, but for how I would live my life if I no longer needed to explain or justify myself to anyone. That same day, I walked into the small mountain town and stopped at a quiet bookstore I used to visit years ago. The owner, a woman named Ruth with kind, crinkly eyes, still remembered me. We did not talk much. I picked out a few books, mostly biographies of quiet, unassuming women who had changed their lives late in life. I left without announcing who I was or why I was there. I did not need to be the woman with the folder full of legal papers, not today. By the third day, the cabin felt as if it belonged to me. Not because I owned it, but because I had brought myself there by my own choice. There is something profoundly powerful about reclaiming a space, even a temporary one. It is the difference between escaping and returning to oneself. I wrote letters that night, not to Bradley, not to Juliana. I wrote letters to myself. I wrote to the version of me at 40, who had spent her birthday alone because her family forgot. I wrote to the version of me at 50, who had helped them buy their first house with a generous gift but was not invited to their housewarming party. I wrote to the version of me at 60, who had quietly paid off their credit card debt when they confided that they could not make the minimum payment. I wrote to each of those women, those past versions of Eleanor, and I told them that they did what they could with the knowledge they had at the time. I forgave them for their misplaced hope, and I thanked them. Because without their endurance, without their quiet pain, I would not be here now, strong enough to walk away, smart enough to plan ahead, and quiet enough to let the truth do its work. That night, the snow turned violent. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass, a stark reminder of how fragile walls can be. But the fireplace stayed lit, and the roof held strong. I did not feel unsafe. I felt awake. The next morning, I checked out early. The road back down the mountain was slick and steep, but I did not rush. At every curve, I thought about what came next. I knew Nadine would be preparing the next round of filings. I knew Juliana would likely try to respond with some version of charm or outrage depending on her audience. I knew Bradley would do what he had always done, go quiet, then passive, then resentful. But I was not going back into that house, and I was not going back into that old version of myself either. Instead of driving back to my apartment, I drove straight to a downtown office building, the one that held the newly registered office for my foundation. The paperwork had been finalized 2 days before. I had not told anyone, not even Marcus. It was my own private beginning. I walked up to the receptionist, a young, professional woman, and handed her my identification. She looked at it, then up at me and smiled. She spoke the name of the foundation aloud. I asked her to say it again, just so I could hear it in the real world. The Montrose Initiative, she said, a place for women over 60 to rebuild, quietly, powerfully, and on their own terms. She handed me a welcome packet. I thanked her, walked into the small, clean office that had been reserved for me, and sat down in the chair behind the desk. There was no ceremony, no applause. But inside I felt something shift, something real and solid taking root. Bradley had once told me I was too sensitive, that I needed to stop taking things so personally. Now, I took things personally on purpose, not out of pain, but out of clarity. Because sometimes, after the snow settles and the world is quiet, you realize the path was not lost. It was just covered for a while. And now, I was walking it on my own. The first time I saw Juliana again, it was not in a courtroom or over a tense phone call. It was at a property showcase for luxury homes. I had not planned it that way, but life develops a strange and fitting rhythm once you stop trying to control its tempo. The real estate firm she worked for was hosting an exclusive tour of newly renovated homes on the outskirts of Denver. One of the homes, a sprawling minimalist ranch-style house with open beams and expensive Scandinavian interiors, had been funded by a private investment group. What Juliana did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that this investment group had recently come under new management. Quietly, discreetly, through a series of shell corporations, that new management was me. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing dark sunglasses and a long, elegant coat. I did not need to hide, but I had no desire to be the center of attention. I walked through the house like any other potential buyer, listening to Juliana's polished, professional voice as she explained the imported Italian tile, the underfloor heating, and the solar panel rebates. She looked exactly the same: perfect hair, a firm voice, and that overly gracious tone she always used when she was selling something. I watched her gesture to a young wealthy couple, explaining the benefits of the upgraded kitchen. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. When she turned and her gaze swept across the room, she saw me. I saw her expression flicker, just for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of confusion and alarm. Then, she composed herself, her professional mask sliding perfectly back into place. She was not sure whether to acknowledge me or ignore me. I did not give her the chance to decide. Instead, I walked into the master bedroom and ran my fingers along the smooth, cool marble of the windowsill. The air smelled of cedar and lemon oil. Everything was staged. Nothing felt lived in, just like their marriage. Chloe, her young assistant, followed me into the room. She was sharp, ambitious, a younger version of Juliana herself. I had seen her once at a family function years ago when she was still new to the team. Now she wore a tailored suit and held a clipboard like a shield. She cleared her throat behind me and said, in a tone that was more arrogant than necessary, that this was a private showing for pre-qualified clients. I turned slowly and looked her directly in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I simply handed her a business card. It was a plain, heavy cardstock with the name of the investment firm printed in simple, block letters. My name, Eleanor Vance, was listed underneath, next to the title, Strategic Partner. Her eyes scanned the card, then widened. She stammered something about needing to check with Juliana. I told her to take her time. I would be in the sunroom. 10 minutes later, Juliana came in. She did not greet me. She did not ask why I was there. She just looked at the business card still clutched in Chloe's hand, and then back at me. I could see the panic churning beneath her calm, collected exterior. I asked her if she had reviewed the latest sponsorship ledger for the property. She did not answer. I already knew she hadn't. The real estate company she worked for had taken a significant bridge loan from a group of silent backers to fund this particular renovation. When I had assumed management of that fund, I had become their silent partner. Not for power, but for positioning. Juliana stood there, rigid, her eyes calculating. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, trying to make sense of this impossibility. She knew this was not random. She knew this was not a coincidence. I told her, my voice quiet but clear, that everything has a paper trail, that all things left behind eventually lead back home. And then I turned and left. I did not wait for a response. I did not need a confrontation. That was not the point. The point was to remind her, and by extension my son, that they had underestimated the wrong woman. That evening, I sat alone at a small cafe just outside the city, sipping black tea as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. A young waitress asked if I needed anything else. I smiled and said, "No, thank you." For the first time in a very long time, I did not feel invisible. Later that night, I checked my email. Nadine had forwarded new correspondence from the court. The investigation had officially moved from a preliminary review to an active motion. There would be interviews, depositions, and, if necessary, hearings. She had also included a list of evidence items that were now sealed for the case. Among them was the footage from the night of the incident, a sworn affidavit from two neighbors who had heard the argument, and the financial history of Bradley's attempts to consolidate my utility bills under his name without my consent. It was slow progress, but it was solid, irrefutable progress. That same week, I received a notification that the final trust paperwork for the Montrose Initiative had gone through. The bank confirmed that the first transfer had settled. $5 million, set aside for operational costs and long-term endowments. I let out a breath I had not even realized I had been holding. I thought about what Juliana might have told Bradley when she got home from the showcase. Whether she had softened the blow or had let the full, terrifying truth sink in, I would never know. That part of their life no longer belonged to me. What mattered was that the ground beneath their feet had begun to shift, and I was no longer the one standing still. I did not hear from Bradley directly, not at first. But the silence itself was telling. For someone who had always managed to insert himself into every conversation, every room, every choice I made, his sudden and complete retreat spoke volumes. Juliana, however, could not help herself. Less than a week after the showcase, I received a forwarded message from Nadine. It was a carefully worded email from Juliana's legal team claiming that there had been misunderstandings and emotional misjudgments during a family dispute. They suggested a resolution outside of court, one that involved mutual agreements, strict privacy clauses, and unsurprisingly, the immediate cessation of all pending legal motions. They wanted to make a deal. I did not respond. Nadine did. Her reply was a model of brevity and steel. The legal process would continue as planned. No further commentary would be entertained outside of official channels. The email chain stopped there. Later that same day, Marcus called. He was not the type of person to panic, but his voice had a tightness I had not heard before. He had received an unexpected inquiry from a third-party real estate group asking for ownership verification regarding one of the commercial parcels linked to my trust. Apparently, someone was trying to poke holes, to find a weakness in my financial armor. I asked Marcus what he needed from me. He paused, then told me that he had already handled it. The documents had been reinforced months ago, thanks to the restructuring we had done early in the year. There was nothing to worry about. Still, he wanted to keep me in the loop. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, staring out at the slow, silent drift of snow. I was not surprised. I had expected pushback. But this was something else. This was desperation disguised as strategy. That evening, I reviewed the list of properties Bradley had once asked me to co-sign for, back when he and Juliana were still trying to build their business. At the time, I had declined politely. Something about the way he had worded the request, as if it were my maternal duty, had made me hesitate. I had not known why back then. I just knew that it felt wrong. Now, it felt like my instinct had once again protected me. A quiet, stubborn instinct. The next morning, Nadine sent another update. The preliminary discovery phase was closing. The court had approved the next step. A pre-motion hearing would be scheduled, and with it, the formal release of evidence to both sides. That meant the footage from the ceramic owl would no longer be just a quiet, private file stored on a secure drive. It would become a matter of official record. I spent that afternoon walking through the local arboretum. Even though the paths were half frozen and the benches were cold, there was something comforting in the simple act of moving forward while everything else in my life seemed to be standing still. As I walked, I thought about the last Christmas I had spent in that house. Juliana had ordered catering. Bradley had barely spoken to me. The grandchildren had been glued to their tablets, uninterested in the gifts I had so carefully picked out and wrapped. I remembered placing a glass ornament on the tree and seeing my own reflection, distorted and fragmented in its silver surface. I did not know then that it would be the last time I would sit at that table. But now, I was glad I had not known, because I might have stayed too long out of a sense of guilt. And guilt, I was learning, was no reason to keep bleeding. Later that week, the court issued a formal notice. The hearing would take place in 2 weeks' time. It would not be dramatic. There would be no televised drama, no packed courtroom, just a judge, a few attorneys, and a great deal of documentation. Still, it would be the beginning of the truth being spoken aloud, in a place where words have weight and consequences. Meanwhile, I kept moving. I met with the first round of advisors for the foundation, a group of remarkable women from different parts of the state. Some had lost their spouses, some had lost their homes. But all of them had one thing in common. They had been overlooked. As I sat there, listening to them share their ideas, their passion, and their wisdom, I realized something profound. For all the silence I had endured in that house, for all the times my voice was softened or dismissed or ignored, I had never truly lost it. I had just been speaking to the wrong people. After the meeting, one of the women walked up to me. Her name was Janice. She had soft, kind eyes, but her voice had a quiet weight to it. She told me that she had seen the way I listened, not just to formulate a reply, but to hold space, to make room for someone else's truth to be heard. It was the kindest, most insightful thing anyone had said to me in a very long time. That night, I pulled the folder out again, the one I had kept since the very beginning, the one that now held my medical files, my financial records, copies of the trust, and the external hard drive containing the video. I placed it inside a new, fireproof safe I had installed in my apartment the week prior. Because it was no longer just about protection, it was about preparation. The house that Bradley and Juliana had tried so hard to control was no longer theirs to leverage. The bank, alerted by the legal proceedings, had frozen their line of credit, citing a review of the underlying collateral. The mortgage had been flagged. Everything was beginning to shake beneath them. And they had no idea how still I had become. Because stillness, I had finally learned, is not weakness, it is waiting with intention, and I was done waiting. It started with a phone call from Nadine on a quiet Thursday morning. Her tone had changed. It was not sharp, but it carried a new weight, a new gravity. The house, my former house, was now officially under investigation by the county. The footage had been reviewed not only by the court but also by a special division within Adult Protective Services that handled cases of elder abuse. They were taking it very seriously, she said. There would be an official site visit. Officers would be sent out, not just to collect more evidence, but to walk the ground, to see the place where it had happened, to observe the setting in its real physical context. Juliana had been the first one to call the court that morning after being notified, apparently frantic, apparently caught completely off guard. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not even feel relief. I just felt a deep stillness, like watching the first long, dark crack spread across the surface of a frozen pond. I did not ask for details. Nadine said she would handle everything. What I needed to do now was to stay steady. No contact. No sudden movements. The process was working exactly as it was intended to. Later that day, I sat at my small dining table, my fingers resting on the smooth, warm ceramic of a teacup. The snow outside had begun to melt slightly, a rare moment of winter sun cracking through the weeks of persistent gray. I let the weak sunlight land on my face through the window. It was quiet, warm, and unbothered. That afternoon, I received a text message from an unfamiliar number. It was short, with no greeting. "Your neighbors are talking. What are you doing to us?" There was no name signed, but I knew. The number was a new prepaid phone, but the panic, the entitled indignation, was pure Bradley. He had not spoken a single word directly to me in months, not since the night his hands had pushed me, not since my blood had soaked into the floorboards of a house he no longer controlled. I did not respond. I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Nadine. She flagged it for documentation as attempted witness intimidation. That evening, I went for a walk through the city, my route taking me not far from the courthouse. I passed by one of the large, prestigious law offices that had once rejected my initial inquiry, back when I had come in without a lawyer, with just a bruised wrist and a tremble in my voice. They had not even offered me a consultation, just a polite, dismissive nod and the phone number to a public hotline. Now, I walked past their gleaming brass plaque without a trace of bitterness. I had Nadine now. I had a file the size of a hardback novel. I had the official attention of the court. At home, I reviewed the timeline of events again, not because I had forgotten any of it, but because I needed to remember how long it had taken for the truth to finally take shape. The fall, the silence, the cold kitchen, the motel room, the apology that never came. The first quiet email to Nadine, the transfer of the footage, the silent filing of the complaint, the first certified letter, the desperate pushback, the showcase, the power shift in the sunroom, the frantic call from Marcus, the trust, established and fortified, the hearing, scheduled. And now, the site visit. None of it had happened overnight, but all of it, taken together, had built something solid, something undeniable. The next morning, I received word that the officers had completed their visit to the house. They had spoken with the neighbors. One of them, a woman named Mrs. Kendall, who lived 2 doors down, had given a sworn statement. She said she had seen me leave that night with a torn coat and what looked like blood on my sleeve. She had been afraid to say anything before, she admitted. Afraid of disrupting the quiet neighborhood, afraid of being dragged into something ugly. But the official presence of the investigators and the knowledge of the footage had changed that. It was no longer a matter of her opinion against theirs. It was a matter of fact. Nadine told me there was now growing talk inside the prosecutor's office about formally charging both Bradley and Juliana, not just with misdemeanor assault, but with felony endangerment and the intentional concealment of evidence. They had waited too long to claim it was an accident. They had done too much, too quietly, to cover it up. That weekend, I visited the office of the foundation again. There was a new sign on the wall now, a soft, ivory-colored plaque with the name in raised silver letters, the Montrose Initiative. A young woman greeted me at the door. She was just 23, an intern working toward her nursing degree. She smiled brightly and offered to show me around, not knowing who I was. I told her I preferred to walk alone for a moment. She nodded, respectful and understanding. I moved through the small space slowly, room by room, looking at the shelves of new books, the boxes of supplies ready to be delivered to rural libraries and senior centers, the stack of grant applications for wellness workshops written by women who had lived their lives too quietly for too long. I lingered in the conference room. I ran my hand along the smooth edge of the long wooden table, sat down for a moment in one of the chairs, and looked out the window. A life can look so ordinary on paper, but the decisions that shape it, the moments that define it, often come quietly, unannounced, and uncelebrated. Like sitting in a courtroom, not as the accused, but as the primary witness. Like hearing your own son's name spoken aloud in a flat legal tone. Like knowing you did not have to raise your voice to finally raise the truth. I left the building just as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. On the drive home, Nadine called again, this time with something new. The county clerk had just received a sealed filing from Juliana's attorney. It was a request for early mediation. Voluntary, private, a last desperate attempt to avoid formal charges being laid. It meant only one thing. They knew what was coming, and they were afraid. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, rolled the window down, and let the cold, sharp air sting my face. I did not feel victorious. I felt awake. I felt alive. And I felt for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly unbroken. The day of the hearing was not loud. There were no flashing cameras from news vans, no packed gallery of curious onlookers. There was just a small, sterile courtroom on the second floor of the county building. Its tall windows faced a row of gray, skeletal trees that had long since lost their leaves. The room was cold and smelled faintly of old carpet and paperwork. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in navy slacks, a dark cashmere sweater, and my late husband's elegant, understated watch. I wore it not because it brought me comfort, but because it reminded me of the decades I had spent holding everything together for others. Today was not about memory. It was about ownership. Nadine was already seated at the plaintiff's table, her leather briefcase open, papers arranged in neat, orderly rows like soldiers on parade. Her calm, focused presence steadied the air. She gave me a slight, reassuring nod without a word, then looked back down at her notes. Across the aisle, Bradley sat stiffly beside his attorney. His suit did not fit him well. The shoulders were too tight, the fabric cheap. Perhaps it was borrowed, or perhaps it no longer belonged to the man he was trying to pretend to be. His eyes flickered toward me for a single, fleeting second, then dropped immediately to the polished surface of the table in front of him. Juliana entered 3 minutes later. She wore all black, a severe, joyless ensemble. She wore no jewelry, not even her wedding ring. She did not sit beside Bradley. She took a seat in the row behind him, alone, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if holding herself together. The judge arrived. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a voice like dry wood snapping. She did not look at anyone for too long. She simply read the file in front of her, called the room to order, and began. It started with the clerk reading the official charges from the complaint. First, misdemeanor elder abuse. Then, obstruction of reporting a crime. Then, Attempted coercion of property through emotional manipulation. 3 charges, each one followed by a long, heavy pause that seemed to echo in the silent space between us. I did not look at Bradley. I did not need to. I could feel his shame radiating across the room like a cold wave. Then came the presentation of the primary evidence. Nadine stood, her movements precise and focused, and presented the footage. A large monitor had been rolled into the room, facing the judge's bench. There would be no sound, she explained, just the video. I had only watched it once, in that dreary motel room, alone. Now, I watched it again, in this cold official space, but this time, I did not flinch. My eyes remained fixed on the screen for the entire duration. Bradley's arm, reaching across the frame. My body, staggering backward. The glass, shattering into 1,000 pieces. My form, disappearing from view. And then, the long, damning silence. The video ended. The screen went black. There was no gasp in the courtroom. There was just a profound, heavy stillness. Even the judge sat motionless for several seconds before making a note on her legal pad and signaling for the next item. Then came the oral statements. Nadine kept hers short, factual, and devoid of emotion. She did not dramatize. She spoke only of the documented facts. My injury, the delay in their reporting, the subsequent attempts at intimidation, the documentation of asset transfers and financial inquiries that Bradley had attempted in the weeks leading up to the incident. A pattern, she called it. A pattern that was subtle but clear. Bradley's attorney responded with deflection and excuses. He spoke of stress, of miscommunication, of a family argument that had been taken out of context. He tried to paint a picture of a devoted son pushed too far by misunderstandings. He described the event as a moment of unintentional harm. Then, Juliana was asked if she wished to make a statement on her own behalf. Her lawyer leaned in and whispered to her. She shook her head, a single, sharp movement. No words. In that moment, her silence was the loudest thing she had ever said to me. The judge did not deliberate for long. She did not hand down a full sentence. This was only the evidentiary hearing, a procedural step, but she did rule on the immediate motions. She ruled that the case would proceed to a full review by the district attorney's office for criminal charges. She ruled that the evidence presented was more than sufficient to warrant further action. She ruled that the protective order I had requested would be extended indefinitely. Bradley was ordered to have no contact with me, in any form. Juliana, as well. All financial access to accounts that were even tangentially related to my assets was frozen. Shared accounts were placed under a full forensic audit. The investigation would now expand. When the gavel came down with a sharp final crack, I did not exhale a breath I had been holding. I simply stood, nodded once to Nadine, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the wind had picked up, and dead leaves scraped across the sidewalk like dry, whispering voices. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the courthouse steps. Every step felt earned. I went to the small cafe nearby, the one I had visited before, and ordered a small black coffee. I sat at the same corner table. No one recognized me. No one needed to. I opened my green notebook and drew a firm, straight line through that day's date. Then, I turned to a fresh, clean page and wrote a single sentence. I am not broken. When I returned home to my apartment that evening, a letter was waiting for me. It had been slipped under my door. It was not an email, not a text message, but a physical letter, handwritten. It was from Bradley. The envelope was plain, the handwriting uneven, as if his hand had trembled while writing it. He said he was sorry. He said he had been under immense pressure from Juliana, from his business. He said he did not know what had come over him. He said he never expected it to go this far. He asked me to remember the boy he used to be. I read the letter once, then a second time. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Not out of bitterness, but because I was beginning to understand that forgiveness is a quiet, personal process, not a performance for someone else's benefit. That night, I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I did not cry. I did not smile. I just sat in the quiet, letting the night hold its own weight. The house they had tried to take from me had been legally restored to my sole unassailable control. The deed was corrected, the will updated, the trust ironclad. My foundation, the Montrose Initiative, had officially gained its full nonprofit status. We had our first official board meeting scheduled in 2 weeks. There were lives I was now in a position to help change. Not out of revenge, but simply because I could. And that, I realized, was true power. Not the kind that shouts and dominates, but the kind that quietly builds.